So I think broadly, if we take the example of communities dependent on the river for their basic livelihoods and basic needs on one hand, and the needs of conservation for different species on the other, there are both synergies and trade-offs. I would begin with that submission, because both depend on availability of water, first of all. So in that sense, fishermen also need enough water for getting a good catch, and dolphins and crocodiles and turtles also need adequate water so that they are able to get their prey. This makes them natural allies in some sense, because if we have to ask for more water to be released from a dam so that a particular community does not suffer, or a particular species that is not at risk of losing out on its prey, for example, uh, then it's a combined demand. It's a human and ecological demand for water that is combined. So they become natural allies. That doesn't mean that everything is harmonious in terms of the relationship between them. Many conservationists also often assume this, that ultimately people and wildlife are like buddies, or they can coexist peacefully. One should understand that this may not be always the case for every species or every community. Some communities have had cultural practices of targeted hunting. Now, if they are going to hunt already limited numbers of species, of different species, coexistence is not possible. In some communities, there has been some history of some protection. So maybe there it's possible. So again, painting with a broad brush of either conflict or coexistence is not going to help. I know fishing definitely has negative impacts on wildlife, like I was talking about the Gangetic dolphin. Similarly, for other species also. Some species are like the Ghadial crocodile, for example, is so sensitive to any human disturbance that it's usually not able to tolerate much fishing activity around it, or too many boats moving about it. And clearly, it's much more endangered than the Ganges dolphin, for example. Whereas the river dolphin is relatively more tolerant of human activity, more resilient, let's say. Can cope with even fairly modified river ecosystems and so on. Of course, there will be a limit to that also. Now, given all these things, the recognition that we must factor in the rights of communities is very important. We can't say that, for millions of people, I'm talking about the fishing communities of the Gangetic Plains, there is no good estimate, but let's say about 10 million people are directly or indirectly dependent on it. And if we only take the Gangetic Plains in India, and what do we do with the basic needs of these people? They live in poverty. Many of them are landless. Their children don't get good education. Health facilities are remote because their places where they stay are along river banks, which may be inaccessible during the floods, for example. Um, it's a hard life. It's a life without dignity. And the argument is equally important, that why should the conservation of some evolutionarily fascinating species deny the right to dignity for such a large population of people? And I think both things are important. I think conservationists and social scientists also uh, have to be prepared to lose something on the way if they want to balance livelihoods and conservation. Of course, it's easier said than done. But I think in general, conservationists, at least from what I have seen, try more towards achieving that balance. Whereas for people coming from the development or social sector, the conservation idea is a little secondary. I'm not saying this as a criticism, but their motivations are often more on the human development aspects. Now, how we integrate both these sort of ways of thinking into creating spaces for coexistence, as well as proper protection to some species which need it, as well as allocations to human rights for basic access to resources, is a challenge. I think there are potentially many solutions, which are again not, which are tentative. but we need to keep trying them out, learning from them, adapting as the situation changes. If you look at the fishing community, a lot of fishermen are now exiting from their traditional profession of fishing. That's because rivers are increasingly polluted or hurt by activity, by the operations of dams, etc. So fish catches are becoming increasingly uncertain. A lot of the areas in the Gangetic Plains, the fisheries on the rivers are under the control of many a times under the control of criminal gangs, increasingly so. It's something similar to how the sand mining economy has evolved. It's very difficult for us to imagine the sand mining economy without mentioning the word mafia or something like that. And something similar seems to have happened with fisheries, unfortunately. All these factors have led to people just moving out. They say we don't want to continue this wretched sort of livelihood and existence where we are not able to uh, earn enough for our families. We might as well go and work as construction laborers, which brings in a whole dimension of human migration to cities, slums, the emotional trauma that migrants face and their families back home face, as we witnessed during the COVID first wave, for example. All these things are squarely related to the conservation of the species that are there. So it's very easy to say that, oh, good, now fishermen have gone away, we can protect ghadials. But the costs to society at a larger scale also have to be considered. There is scope to, I think, make it at least attempt to make it work. For example, many of our laws in I'm talking about the specific case about managing fisheries and even our Wildlife Protection Act, for example, they're mostly laws based on banning things, which is important to some extent, of course. But I think there is room for, again, creating more adaptive models of governance, focusing on community level cooperative sort of governance of fisheries, for example. Instead of blanket restrictions on certain fishing practices that have existed from colonial times, actually studying the impacts of what is happening now and accordingly modifying the law. Now, the thing is, whether it's the state or whether it's conservationists, law is often held sacrosanct. Nobody messes with the law. That's like the final word. And I think it doesn't have to be. I think a lot of restrictive guidelines that have come from such laws have also caused suffering for people and their interactions with species also. So there is definitely scope to tweak some of these policies and laws to enable fishing, for example, while certain restrictions and guidelines are of course needed to not exceed a certain effort or not use a certain destructive practice. But I think the thinking is not as much on this approach. And one of the things we try to do is definitely to encourage managers to think of these approaches first, and sort of give up on what they have learned in their fisheries college, for example, and come up with new ways of thinking about managing a very complex system where multiple species are harvested using 200 types of fishing nets and gears. So the law also has to deal with those challenges, and I think in terms of a direct intervention, working with the law and policy is important. And of course, the social sector helping. We have to realize that communities are aspirational communities. They are not stuck in time. So romanticizing fisheries and their relationship with wildlife is not going to get us anywhere. At the same time, complete bans, restrictions on such communities are also not. They're only going to create more conflict. So again, this is a very rambling sort of response, but I think uh, the issue is such that one has to get a bit lost in that whole complexity and then try to find threads on which they can track them and work out more adaptive cooperative models.